These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? Black's queen has taken the offensive, attacking your knight on c5. Consider your counter-attacking possibilities before resorting to defensive play. A queen sitting as far toward the middle of an open board as Black's does here should generate thoughts of skewers. This queen in particular is aligned with several of its pieces. What you need is a piece of your own that can attack the queen safely while also aimed through it at a worthwhile target. Bishop moves to f4 fits the bill. The bishop attacks the queen, and is protected by the rook on f1. Black can use his queen to guard the rook on b8, but that's okay. White still wins the exchange. White to move. What is the best move? The idea can be slightly harder to see in a position like this where the queen is nestled back among its own pieces. Get used to spotting the significance of patterns like the alignment of Black's rook and queen on d8 and c7 with open squares on the diagonal ahead of them. Pieces so arranged invite an attack by a bishop, as with bishop moves to b6, this time taking protection from the white knight on a4 and again winning the exchange after Black moves his queen to safety. White to move. What is the best move? We're looking at lots of these positions because it's so important to become visually sensitive to enemy pieces on the same line. There are several here on the 7th rank, but more critical is the alignment of Black's queen and rook in the corner, the same kernel as in the last problem. White has several ways to put an attacker on that diagonal with his queen, but of course that's no good since Black just plays queen takes queen. White needs to attack with his bishop from a protected square to prevent Black's queen from biting back. Bishop moves to d5 accomplishes the mission. So you think, 1 bishop moves to d5, queen moves to c8, 2 bishop takes rook, queen takes bishop, and white wins the exchange. Good, but now look for better. After black moves his queen to c8, white can play the check. Queen moves to e4, check. Once black moves his king, white can take black's rook with impunity because his bishop now has the queen's protection. Black to move. What is the best move? White's position looks solid and well fortified. Is there a weakness? Yes, the kernel of rook plus queen on a diagonal, as white has here on e2 and f1, once again is a vulnerability. The pieces are on a light squared diagonal, so black just needs to get his light squared bishop into line with them with protection, of course. He plays bishop moves to a6, made safe by the knight on b8, and wins the exchange after white's queen moves. Before plunging ahead, though, take a moment to ask whether white would have any defenses against black's skewer. One idea to consider is an interposition. Can white block the attack by planting something in its way? Here he could, with knight moves to b5. But notice that white's knight then has pinned itself to its queen. So black rethinks the resulting position, now looking at it as a pin, and goes after the paralyzed knight with pawn from c7 moves to c6. White could add a defender with pawn from a2 moves to a4, but it doesn't matter. Extra defenders are no consolation when one of your pieces is about to get taken by a pawn. Black to move. What is the best move? Where is the key weakness in white's position? Look for alignments of his pieces. By now it should be no trouble to spot the white queen and a 2 rook on the same diagonal. An attack by black with a protected bishop will scare the queen out of the way, leaving white no time to move the rook behind it. White can use the queen to protect the rook, but so long as black is using a bishop rather than a queen he is happy to make a trade that wins the exchange. He plays a bishop to the diagonal with bishop moves to e6, the protection being furnished this time by a pawn, and wins the exchange next move. White to move. What is the best move? White looks at everything his pieces attack and sees an apparently attractive opportunity, a loose pawn on e7 that he can take with his queen. Any problem with this? The capture is a disaster for White because now he has done Black the favor of clearing the e-file of everything except White's own queen and rook. A queen and rook on an open file can form a powerful battery and serve as part of an effective mating attack, but it also can serve as the kernel of an unwelcome pin or skewer. The vulnerability of the pair depends in part on the quality of the protection the pieces enjoy. Here White's rook on e1 has no protection on the first rank, and indeed no protection from any piece but the queen, a characteristic of many targets of skewers. Black thus is able to reply with rook moves to e8, where the rook forces the queen out of the way with protection from the knight on f6 as well as the rook on a8. The queen has no square to which it can retreat and keep protecting the rook on e1, so Black will take the rook next move. Or White will have to let his queen go and recapture with the rook. The lesson: before making any capture even of a loose piece or pawn, consider whether you are aligning your pieces in troublesome ways that would allow a skewer or pin by your opponent. The actual best move for White here is knight moves to d2, which enables him to threaten queen takes at e7 for real. Moving his knight out of the way like this connects the rooks on his back rank, allowing them to defend each other and thus immunizing the e1 rook and the queen from the threat of a skewer. White to move. What is the best move? Simple skewers through rooks. Our next pattern to consider involves skewers where a rook has to jump out of the way and leave a piece behind it to be taken. In this first case, notice the little knot created by Black's rook and knight. Their alignment suggests the usefulness of running them through with bishop moves to d5, which wins a piece. When the rook moves, the loose knight behind it gets taken. It would be different if the rook could move and protect the knight at the same time, but it can't. Not all skewers involve loose pieces, but many of them do, so when you see a loose piece, look for other enemy pieces on the same line and be especially sensitive to clustered pairs like Black's knight and rook here. White to move. What is the best move? What is White's strongest move? There are two ways to see it: look for black pieces on the same line, and spot the two rooks on the same dark squared diagonal, or look for loose pieces, find the rook on d6, and experiment with attacks on it, especially along lines it shares with other enemy pieces. Either way the answer is straightforward. White plays bishop moves to b4, attacking both rooks. Black can move one of the rooks to protect the other, but he still loses the exchange. This is an important pattern to remember. Anytime two enemy rooks are lined up on a diagonal, consider whether you might run them through with a bishop. White to move. What is the best move? Perhaps the most obvious pattern of interest on the board is the alignment of black's king and rook on the 5th rank. The most obvious, but not the most useful, more significant is the alignment of the two black rooks on the same diagonal, another clustered pair. In this case the rooks are on light squares, so white finds his light squared bishop and charts the course bishop moves to e8. Black doesn't have time to save both pieces. The best he can do is play the rook on g6 to h6 so that it can recapture after white plays bishop takes rook. White nevertheless wins the exchange. Notice that a search for black loose pieces would have turned up this idea as well. Having found a loose rook on h5, you look at ways to attack it on every one of its lines, including the seemingly remote diagonal leading to e8. White to move. What is the best move? This position is the same as the last one, but with a black pawn on c6 that blocks the bishop's path to e8. Now what should white do? Answer, of course examine every check. This leads you to bishop moves to b3, which forces black to move his king, probably to c5. Ask what now becomes possible and you find the same skewering idea we saw a moment ago. Bishop moves to f7, winning the exchange next move. In effect this position involves two skewers. With bishop moves to b3, white skewers black's king to the skewering square f7. The key here, as before, is to recognize that rooks on the same diagonal create a good target for a bishop or, sometimes, a queen. Once you see that possibility, whether right away or after the check, the rest is engineering. Black to move. What is the best move? This should be an easy one now. Your typical search for ideas includes a scan for loose pieces and any enemy pieces on the same line. Here those inquiries point to the rook on a1, which is loose and is lined up with the other white rook on d4. Your first choice of attacker on a diagonal is a bishop. In this case bishop moves to f6 skewers the two rooks, again winning the exchange after one moves to protect the other. Black to move. What is the best move? Substituting the king to create a skewer. Most of the techniques involved in creating skewers where elements are missing will be familiar from our work with pins, but the visual patterns look a little different. In this first study Black has a powerful resource in his doubled rooks but no immediate way to exploit it. Rather than obsess over the g-file, pause and obey the first law of tactical operations, viz., look at any checks you can give and their consequences. It doesn't take long, as there are only two. Rook moves to g2, check. Which loses the rook to bishop takes rook, and rook takes bishop, check. Which loses the rook to king takes rook but in a capture that requires the king to move, and thus requires an inspection of the king's new position. Survey the king's new lines and anything else on them. Here white has put his king into alignment with his rook on the light squared diagonal leading to d1. This calls for a skewer. Black plays bishop moves to g4, check. And white has to move his king away, it can't guard the rook, so black wins a piece with bishop takes rook. The alignment of white's king and rook after the preliminary exchange would be a visual cue to the skewer. You could have proceeded as well, of course, by simply looking for any checks black can give on the board as it would look after white's king moves, again seeing just two. Rook moves to g3, check. Which moves the white king unhelpfully, and bishop moves to g4, check. Which also moves the white king but this time allows bishop takes rook afterwards. The large theme of the position is the idea of forcing a king to move by taking a piece that it protects and then skewering it on its new square. Let's look at a couple of other applications of the same idea. White to move. What is the best move? It would be easy enough to become preoccupied in this position with the pinned black bishop, but white has no way to exploit it. If he throws a bishop at it, as with bishop moves to c3, the trouble is not merely that black can answer with rook moves to d6, it's that black then has a check in rook moves to b1, check. White having opened a line to his king when he moved his bishop. White then must interpose his bishop at e1, as all of his king's flight squares are under attack. With white's bishop now pinned and black to move, he hits the immobilized piece with a pawn, pawn from f3 moves to f2. Black wins. The key to the position for white is to step back from the pin and look for other patterns. Black's bishop and rook are aligned on the same diagonal, and this is grounds to consider possible pins or skewers. White has a bishop that can attack on the dark squared diagonal with bishop moves to f2, but this runs into the same trouble just described. Black's reply of rook moves to b1, check. Look for your opponent's next check, not just your own. It would be different if White's move gave check. Might this be arranged? Yes, with the substitution 1. Rook takes bishop, check. King takes rook. Another route to the same conclusion is to just consider any checks White can give. Here there is only one rook takes bishop. Black is forced to reply king takes rook, and with his king moved you look at the new lines it occupies and see that the kernel of a skewer now has been created. Bishop moves to f2, check. Attacks Black's king, requiring him to spend a move taking it out of the way. Then bishop takes rook takes Black's rook before it has time to give check. Black to move. What is the best move? With bishop moves to g5, Black can aim a bishop through two white pieces, the bishop on d2 and the rook on c1. In itself this won't do any good, so think about ways to force substitutions by making captures. Black has rook takes bishop, inviting White to play king takes rook. Now bishop moves to g5, check. Becomes wonderfully productive. The king must move off the diagonal and leave the rook behind it loose, because the g4 bishop attacks d1. After bishop takes rook, Black has netted a piece. Black to move. What is the best move? Other substitutions, queens, rooks, etc. We have seen that sometimes forcing your opponent to substitute his king for another piece will create a working skewer. The same goes, of course, for forced substitutions of other pieces. Take the position to the left. White has no loose pieces and Black has no checks to give. What remains as a source of tactical ideas? Captures. In addition to considering any checks you can give, look piece by piece for any exchanges you can force. Here the only capture available to Black is knight takes bishop. Unless he is content to lose a piece, White has to respond with queen takes knight. The question is how the board will look after the exchange, and whether anything not possible now will become possible then. In this case we see a now familiar pattern. White's queen would be lined up with the rook on a1 on the long dark diagonal. Black still has his dark squared bishop, and he can get it onto the vulnerable line with bishop moves to g7, now the queen must evacuate and allow bishop takes rook. Black doesn't care that the rook on a1 has protection, as he still wins the exchange. You might also have seen this just by observing the alignment of white's bishop and rook on that same diagonal and looking for a way to substitute a better piece for the bishop. This isn't an easy train of thought, because by itself a bishop in front of a rook often will not signify anything. It nevertheless is a good habit to notice every time two pieces are lined up like this, so observe the pattern closely. Black to move. What is the best move? Read the board, again looking for alignments of enemy pieces and especially enemy pieces aligned with nothing between them. White has a few pieces so arranged, his bishop and queen are on the same diagonal, as are his bishop and rook. With bishop moves to e6, black can run a bishop through the latter two pieces. In itself this doesn't achieve anything, but with a substitution it might. So imagine exchanges and consider whether they would improve your prospects. Here black's knight on e5 can take white's bishop on c4. This requires white to recapture with queen takes knight. Now we have the kernel of a productive skewer, we have created again the classic queen before rook pattern. All that's left for black is to get a bishop safely onto the same diagonal. He plays bishop moves to e6, which in effect attacks two pieces, the queen and the rook behind it. White retreats the queen to e2 so it can guard the rook, and then black wins the exchange. White to move. What is the best move? Notice the diagonal alignment of black's bishop and rook, and that white can run his own bishop through both of them with bishop moves to b4. A bishop skewering a bishop is no good, but it invites a look for productive substitutions. Here knight takes bishop, check. Provokes the recapture, queen takes knight, luring the queen onto the same dark squared diagonal with its rook. White swoops in with his dark squared bishop on b4, where it makes a protected skewer of black's queen and rook and, again, wins the exchange next move. White to move. What is the best move? There are a couple of alignments in black's camp. Rather than sort out each one, probably the more efficient thing is to see what emerges from forcing sequences you can set in motion. You have no checks, but there are two captures to consider. Each white knight can take a pawn and then be recaptured. In reply to knight takes at e5, black plays pawn from d6 takes knight and nothing much has changed. But in reply to knight takes at b5, black plays queen takes knight. His queen would be lined up with its knight on d7, which is loose. Now white can skewer them with his light-squared bishop by playing it to a4, where it retains protection from the queen back on d1. Critically, black's queen has no flight square from which it can continue to guard the knight. White takes the knight next move, and he nets a pawn with the sequence. Skewers of the king are everyone's favorite type, but often the king spends much of a game on the back rank where it is hard to skewer it to anything. The queen, though, does venture into the middle of the board earlier in the game, putting lots of its own pieces behind it where you can make targets out of them. This position is an example. The capture knight takes at b5 goaded the queen into the middle of the board, and in front of the black knight on d7. White to move. What is the best move? You know the drill. Examine checks and captures in search of any sequences that will leave enemy pieces lined up for forks, pins, or, our concern here, skewers. White has no useful checks, but he has a capture that is of some interest. Bishop takes knight. It provokes the recapture bishop takes bishop, a classic trade of minor pieces. Now consider the board as it then would look. The exchange would have left black's bishops lined up on the f-file and both of them loose. Two loose pieces make a great target for a skewer, so white plays rook moves to f2 and wins one of them next move. You might also have seen the idea by noticing black's knight and bishop on the f-file from the start. They don't make for a good skewer because the knight has protection and so cannot be chased out of the way. But one way to deal with a piece that has protection is to capture it, for after the recapture the piece that replaces it may be loose. That is white's procedure here. White to move. What is the best move? This one is harder. Black has just played his knight to e3, attacking the rook on f1 and the pawn on g2, for the third time. White's instinctive response might be defensive, move the rook to safety. But by now you know to ask first whether you might take the initiative and inflict damage with checks or captures of your own. Perhaps you notice that black's knight is aligned vertically with one of his rooks and diagonally with another. The knight and both rooks all are protected, so a skewer doesn't quite work yet, but an exchange can change the picture markedly, so experiment. The only capture for white to consider is rook takes knight. Black replies rook takes rook. Now you see that black's two rooks would be left aligned on a diagonal with no pawns on the line, a pattern that invites a skewer by your bishop if it can be arranged. The trouble is that the bishop cannot safely get onto the rook's line from where it now sits. If it moves to g5 it gets captured. The challenge: maneuver the bishop onto that line, and with threats that give the enemy no time to avoid the emerging skewer. The solution: plot a course to h6 for the bishop that allows it to give check along the way. First bishop moves to g7, check. With protection from the rook on g3, then bishop takes at h6 after black moves his king. Now the bishop attacks both rooks and will take one of them. Or rather, all that is the idea. Before putting it into motion, think carefully about the move order, for in this position it makes a great difference. A. Suppose white starts with rook takes knight, expecting rook takes rook and setting the stage for the skewer by leaving the rooks aligned. He will be in for a nasty surprise. Black ignores the loss of his knight, plays rook takes at g2, check. And mates in two more moves. White's king is forced to h1, black plays rook takes at h2, then moves his other rook to g2 on the next move, ending the game. Lesson: don't take for granted that your opponent's reply to a capture is forced, especially when he has threats against your king. He may be able to ignore the capture and go for mate or threaten some other terrible result. B. Now suppose instead that white starts with bishop moves to g7, check. Forcing king moves to e7, then white immediately plays bishop takes at h6, expecting to play rook takes knight next move. Well, but black simply replies to bishop takes at h6 with knight takes rook. The problem is that white's bishop takes at h6 isn't a check, it gives the initiative back to black. Again, every step of white's sequence needs to be forced to ensure success. See, so the right sequence is to start with 1. Bishop moves to g7, check. King moves to e7, then to play rook takes knight, check. Back at white's end of the board, since that move now is a check, remember that black's king would now be on the e-file. Black would be forced to deal with the check by playing rook takes rook, and now the pieces at last are arranged for the skewer bishop takes at h6. 2 checks, then a skewer, that's what makes it work, as the checks keep white in firm control of the action. By the way, if black replies to bishop moves to g7, check. With king moves to g8, he of course walks his king into the discovered check bishop takes at h6, check. Which white follows next move with bishop takes knight, winning a whole piece. The skewer described in the main line here, sequence, see, above, costs white a bishop and a rook and gains him a knight, a rook, and a pawn. But apart from winning a pawn, it also defuses a bothersome threat black was building with 3 pieces in the white king's neighborhood. The best defense is a good offense. Black to move. What is the best move? Here is a common pattern: a hotly contested piece or pawn near the middle of the board. In a typical case, each side has several pieces trained on the square in contention, perhaps an equal number, suggesting that if you try to take the piece or pawn there, you will gain nothing and perhaps lose some material when the smoke clears. You take, he takes, you take, he takes. but it still is important in such cases to imagine liquidating the position, with all possible exchanges exhausted, for it may be that you then will have a kicker in the form of a fork or skewer against the last piece standing. Look at how the logic applies here. The contested point is white's pawn on e5. Black attacks it with both knights and his queen, white protects it with a bishop, his queen, and the rook behind the queen. So if black takes the pawn with his knight on d7, white recaptures, or could recapture, we're just imagining possibilities, with his bishop. If black takes again with his queen, white retakes with his queen. If black takes a third time with his last knight, white retakes a final time with his rook. The rook is the last piece standing, and this still is true even if the move order goes a little differently than just sketched. Now don't give up once you see this, look for a kicker against the rook. The key is to remember to remove from your mental picture of the board all those pieces that were exchanged away in the interim, white's bishop, queen, and rook, as well as 3 of your own pieces. With those off the board and a rook on e5, you should be able to see an alignment that results. White's 2 rooks are on the long, dark squared diagonal with nothing between them. Now black plays bishop moves to f6, a move that wasn't possible in the beginning because white would have taken the bishop with his e5 pawn. In this position the move skewers white's rooks, both of which are loose and one of which will be lost. You have to keep track of the tally, of course. White will take one of black's pawns while black is playing bishop takes rook, so in the end black ends up losing a pawn, 2 knights, and a queen, but gaining a pawn, a bishop, a rook, and a queen. In other words, he wins the exchange. Assuming he sees all this, too, white will not play even the first move in the sequence, bishop takes knight. He will instead accept the loss of a pawn to knight takes at e5. This is another illustration of a general point. In chess games between good players it is relatively uncommon to see skewers, forks, and the like actually carried out. Both sides see them coming and avoid them by accepting lesser losses. But of course the tactics nevertheless play a crucial role in the game, because the potential for them dictates each side's moves and the losses to which each side decides it must consent. White to move. What is the best move? Checking the king into position. When your opponent's king is checked he has 3 possible replies: move the king, capture the attacker, or interpose something between them. The last 2 frequently are impossible, which is why checks often can be used to push a king around, and which helps explain why the king makes an ideal middle piece in a skewer. Often it has to move out of the way when attacked, exposing whatever is behind it to capture. And this same principle also means that even if the king doesn't appear to be in position to be skewered, you may be able to push it into position with a preliminary check or several of them. In addition to improving your ability to create skewers, these next studies thus will sharpen your ability to see not just what checks you can give, but what checks you will be able to give a move later and then a move after that. We'll start with cases where a single check pushes your opponent's king into position to be skewered. In this first simple position, each side has a king and a rook. Black would mate with rook moves to h8 if it were his turn, but instead white has the move. At a time like this one must operate with checks that hold the initiative. How many checks does white have to consider? Only one: rook moves to a6. White's rook can't be captured and there is nothing to interpose, so black has to move his king. Notice that white's king attacks the 3 squares on the 7th rank where black's king might like to go. With those off limits there is nowhere for black to move his king but the 5th rank, to c5, d5, or e5. Naturally you see now that black's king and rook are aligned, white thus plays rook moves to a5, check. Again forcing black's king to change ranks, perhaps back to its original position, and then comes rook takes rook, ending black's mating threat and winning the game. White to move. What is the best move? Here black's king still is settled on the back rank, so at first the possibility of a skewer may not seem obvious. But consider any checks white can deliver. He can move either rook to e1, which allows black to interpose his own rook at e7 or move his king along the back rank. More interestingly, white can play the rook on h1 to h8. This forces black to move his king to the 7th rank and into line with the rook on c7. Now white moves the rook from h8 to h7, and the king has to move again. Notice that it cannot protect the rook it will be exposing to capture. White's rook on d1 bars the king from the d-file. White wins a rook. Black to move. What is the best move? Another pretty simple case. White's king has ventured far enough onto the board to have queens to its north and south, so you are thinking actively about the skewer that would become possible if you could get white's king and queen lined up with one another. How can you force your opponent to so align them when that is the last thing he wants to do? With checks that force his replies. Look for every check black can give and you see 5, most of them would force the king to move, but queen moves to e1, check. Is the one you jump to because it's safe and puts the king under the greatest pressure, sealing off all its flight squares on the 2nd rank. The d-file also is out, so white's king is driven to f3 or f4 and into line with his queen. Now black plays queen moves to f1, check. And the skewer picks up white's queen once the king is forced out of the way. White to move. What is the best move? Survey the lines on the board and see that black's king and queen are aligned. White has nothing usable to create a pin, but his queen almost can get behind black's king and impose a skewer. Queen moves to g8, however, loses to king takes queen. Might he be able to push the king away from g8 a bit? It would have to be done with checks. White's queen checks, such as queen moves to c7, queen moves to d7, and queen moves to f6, either lose the queen, which white can't afford, or cause black's king to leave the diagonal it now shares with his queen, which is no help, or queen moves to e7 pushes the king to the back rank. How about checks with white's other piece, his knight? There is one. Knight moves to e5, check. The knight can't be taken and black can't interpose anything, so the king must move. Note the squares where the king cannot go, the back rank is forbidden, and e7 and f6 likewise are attacked by white's queen. It is important to see invisible constraints of this kind on the king's movements. The king legally can move only to e6. This creates room behind it for white to play queen moves to g8, check. Safely. When the king moves, as it must, though it can't take the knight, which has protection, white plays queen takes queen and suddenly has a one game. Any chance to squeeze in behind the enemy king should be considered carefully, as this is the stuff skewers are made of. White to move. What is the best move? With black's king out from the back rank and white's queen now behind it, the threat of a skewer again is live. Inspect any checks white can give. There are 4, all with the queen. Queen moves to b6, queen moves to d6, queen moves to e8, and queen moves to g8. As we have seen, the check of greatest interest frequently is the one that gives the enemy the smallest range of replies. Here queen moves to g8, which seals off the king's flight squares on the 7th rank and so requires king moves to f6 as black's only legal reply. Presto, the king and queen once more have been forced onto the same file. Now white's queen moves to f8, applying another check, forcing the king out of the way, and then winning black's queen with queen takes queen. The queen does all the work by itself. White to move. What is the best move? Black has a material advantage, a queen and a bishop against white's 2 bishops. But having 2 bishops trained on the black king's vicinity is strong, too, and with black's queen behind his king white should be alert to any way of forcing an alignment between them. He begins his thinking in the customary way, by looking at any checks. He has bishop moves to g5, which loses a piece, and bishop moves to d4, which requires black's king to move. Where? The f5 and g6 squares are sealed off by white's other bishop, so the black king is driven to f7. Now the desired alignment is in place. White reaches for his next check, using the other bishop to play bishop moves to c4, check. Black's king moves to f8, from which square he will be able to recapture white's bishop after it takes his queen on the next move. A pair of coordinated bishops, like a pair of coordinated rooks, is stronger than the sum of its parts.